Niall Ferguson es historiador, él es británico, escocés, si quiere usted precisarlo de esa forma. Ha escrito un gran número de libros que nos ayudan a entender por qué algunas naciones se han vuelto prósperas, por qué otras naciones no lo han sido y por qué hemos visto, de hecho, un cambio en el que ahora son naciones asiáticas, quizás como Singapur, Hong Kong y China, las que están creciendo con rapidez y las naciones de Europa Occidental y de Norteamérica están declinando. Niall Ferguson, para pronunciarlo en correcto gaélico, la otra pronunciación es un anglicismo. Niall Ferguson, de hecho, ha recibido el premio Una vida por la libertad que otorga Caminos de la Libertad, un proyecto de Grupo Salinas. Yes, and thank you very much for speaking with you again. And I know that your name is Neil and not Niall, even though that the pronunciation Niall is quite common.
It's a great source of frustration to me that half the world calls me Nile, which is, of course, a river in Egypt.
Mm-hmm. Oh, well, that's probably true, but that's what dictionaries say, that that's what they tell you the name Niall should be pronounced, because I think that's how the English mispronounce it.
I called my youngest child Thomas, so he would never have these problems.
And talking about the English and talking about the Scots, you are Scottish. You took a position against the independence of Scotland. I thought that was very, very interesting. Why did you do that? I know that you feel very Scottish. At the same time, you feel British. Can you be both?
You certainly can. My grandfathers were, and their grandfathers before them. Scotland and England united in a kind of marriage of equals between 1603 and 1707. That's a long time ago. Mm-hmm. And ever since then, the combination of England and Scotland has been a pretty successful one. I never had any difficulty growing up in thinking of myself as both Scottish and British. And I think it's very important that we should recognize the possibility of such dual identities. A world that subdivides and subdivides and subdivides until everybody belongs to a country with approximately 5 million people is not going to be a prosperous world. There are far too many countries already in Europe that have populations less than 6 million. We really didn't need another.
What would your position be with respect to Catalonia? Would it be the same?
Very much so. Mm-hmm. Indeed, in that case, it's different because constitutionally it's extremely hard to see how there could be a legitimate referendum on Catalonian independence. In Scotland, the referendum was legally offered by the British government to the residents of Scotland. I didn't get to vote. It was only people resident in Scotland who got to vote.
Even though you're Scottish.
I'm as Scottish as it's possible to be, I think. But only residents of Scotland voted, which meant that English people who happened to be living in Edinburgh got to vote. Decisively, it was rejected, 55 to 45. And I hope that's the end of the matter, really, because this is the kind of debate that wastes an awful lot of time and energy. The real question, it seems to me, that's important is whether the United Kingdom should remain part of the European Union. That's a bigger, higher stakes question.
And what is your opinion? What is your position?
I think it must. I think it must. I mean, broadly speaking, I'm against disintegration. There's enough disintegration going on in our world today, enough political fragmentation. The tendency in Europe towards integration has been a benign one, and although the European Union is not perfect, and I've been very critical of many aspects of it, for the United Kingdom to leave it would, I think, be economically catastrophic for both Britain and Europe. So in just the same way as I oppose Scotland leaving the United Kingdom, I'm against the United Kingdom leaving the European Union.
Dr. Ferguson, you have been accused of not being politically correct. Does it worry you?
It doesn't worry me at all. In fact, if I ever became politically correct, it would be a sign that I'd lost my freedom of thought, because what is political correctness? It's a euphemistic way of saying that certain things cannot be said. It's a way of restricting the freedom of speech. It's a way of policing what academics can say. And as soon as somebody tries to stigmatize what you're saying by saying, oh, well, that's not politically acceptable, they're really trying to censor you. So for me, the whole epidemic of political correctness, especially in American universities, is a fundamental assault on the freedom of speech, which is central to successful academic life.
It has been said that countries needed to be democratic in order to develop, in order to prosper. But now we have first China growing 10% a year. We have examples like Hong Kong, which is in fact having a very peculiar struggle for more political freedom, but we also have Singapore, which has been a benign dictatorship for many years. What's your position on that requirement of political freedom in order to have economic development?
Historically, it's very hard to make an argument that democracy is a necessary precondition for economic growth, because the Industrial Revolution happened in 18th century Britain, which was very far from being democratic. It was an aristocratic society. There was a parliamentary system, but it was far from being democratic. Only a very restricted class of property owners got to vote. So historically, this is a no-brainer. There clearly isn't some kind of necessity to have democracy before you can have growth. And the contemporary examples that you've just listed make it clear that, especially in East Asia, it is perfectly possible to have very rapid growth without democracy. So the key question is, what are the institutions that you need to have for growth to be sustainable? And here I think the debate gets interesting. We have spoken before about the importance of the rule of law.
Yes.
That was something that really differentiated Britain from the rest of the world in the 18th century. It was much easier to be a capitalist in 18th century Britain, where the rule of law was very firmly established on the basis of private property rights. When one looks at Hong Kong and Singapore, one can see an Asian version of that. But when one looks at China, mainland China, there is no rule of law. So one of the big puzzles about China's growth since the late 1970s is, how have they managed to have growth at around 10% without anything resembling the rule of law, with private property rights constantly compromised by a corrupt one-party state? One conclusion we can draw is that China is probably going to have to experience some kind of political change, or at least some transition towards rule of law, if its growth is to be sustainable. I think it's extremely difficult to have a stable market economy without the rule of law. You can have it for maybe 30 years, but I think we can already see all sorts of danger signs in China about what may happen if you try to keep on going with a fundamentally corrupt one-party state.
I know you're not a specialist on Mexico, and that's why I'm actually going to make the next question. What's your view of Mexico? Mexico has been making reforms. Some of them are good, some of them are not so good. We continue to have serious problems in the application of the rule of law. But what's your view as someone who doesn't live in Mexico, who doesn't specialize in Mexico, regarding the country's perspectives?
Well, first, I have terrific affection for this country. I first came here at the age of 17 back in 1981 and was absolutely stunned by its beauty and by the extraordinary warmth of the people. After a long absence, I returned a few years ago. And I was very startled by the trip, because I suddenly realized that Mexico was not simply a war zone, which is how it's represented in the New York Times. That the way that the United States tends to represent Mexico is very negatively. So I sat down and I did a bit of research, and I realized that if one simply compared Mexico with Brazil, the other really big Latin American economy, they're actually very alike. It's just that everybody thinks Brazil is sexy and Mexico is violent. So my argument...
Well, their bikinis are smaller.
Well, this is a kind of bad basis for economic judgment.
I can see that.
My argument for the last 3 years has been, one should be long Mexico, one should be positive about Mexico and rather negative about Brazil. Clearly, it's a huge undertaking to try to reform the Mexican economy. There are enormous obstacles to a liberalization of, say, the energy market or telecoms. But it's happening. And many people would have said just a few years ago, they'll never do it. So I think one has to give this government of Enrique Peña Nieto some points for being, in comparison with other governments around the world, one of the most ambitious in terms of constitutional and legislative reform. No government is perfect, but unlike many governments I could name, this is a government that's actually trying to reform some pretty fundamental things about the way Mexico works. It won't deliver immediate results. That's the tough thing about energy liberalization. This is all going to take a long time to turn out jobs and to raise people's incomes and living standards. But my sense is that Mexico is heading in the right direction. And in that sense, I'm pretty positive. Not that I'm blind to the ongoing problems. I think they're enormous, especially when it comes to issues of crime, corruption, all of those issues that have reared their ugly head again in such a terrible way in just the last couple of weeks. But I think the fundamental direction of this country is a good one, and there are reasons to be much more optimistic about Mexico than many other Latin American countries.
One of the biggest discussions, the biggest debates in Mexico over the past few months, and it's going to continue for the next at least a couple of years, is about the opening up of the energy sector. You're a Scotsman. You have, well, Scotland has tremendous resources. What do you say to people who tell you or who say in Mexico that allowing private investment in energy is equivalent to surrendering sovereignty?
I think this is a kind of anachronistic argument that belongs in the mid-20th century. Clearly, these assets, natural resources, are a part of a nation's patrimony, and they are bound to be a very important source of revenue for any country that is lucky enough to have them, and Mexico has way more than Scotland. The question is, how can one best exploit these natural resources in a way that is sustainable and in a way that is efficient? And it is very clear that having a single state monopoly entity is not the way to do that. There needs to be some competition, and there needs to be foreign capital. If you're going to develop all the amazing resources that Mexico has, you can't do it on your own. And the same applies, I think, to other countries in this part of the world. Further south in Argentina, there's no way that the huge resources there will be developed if the government carries on in its present way. So I think this is an extremely exciting time. Because natural gas is making the Americas, not just North America, but all of the Americas suddenly look at an era of extraordinary energy independence and potentially extraordinary prosperity. So I think this is exactly the right way to go. And those who still are hung up on the idea that the oil industry should be nationalized and under direct state control need to get into the 21st century and look at the way successful countries that have made the most of their natural resources have done the job, and that would include Norway, for example. There are all kinds of role models out there that Mexico can learn from, and I'm glad to say that it's happening.
Niall Ferguson, I do want to thank you for this conversation.
My pleasure.
Y a usted, amigo televidente, que hace posible este programa, se lo agradezco también. Esto es todo por hoy, pero no se lo olvide. Nos vemos la próxima.